Picture this. The fight is over. The retiarius lies tangled in his own net, a trident stuck in the sand beside him. The victor, a Mamilo, yanks his sword free from the man's chest. He doesn't look at the body. He doesn't look at the crowd. He turns, his chest heaving, and slams the pommel of his sword against a small, dark wooden gate at the arena's edge. The crowd's roar changes. It becomes hungry. The gate creaks open. A terrified attendant shoves a young woman out onto the sand. She stumbles and falls to her knees, her simple tunic already stained by the bloody ground. The Mamilo doesn't offer a hand. He grabs her by the upper arm, pulling her roughly to her feet. He begins to drag her back toward the Porta Sana Viveria, the gate of life, the exit for victors. This is his prize. This single but brutal action is the entire reason you are here. We are forced to ask the question, what Roman gladiators did to female slaves after this moment. What happened next, in the darkness beneath the stands, that led history to whisper of a fate worse than death? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Welcome to our investigation. The title of this documentary is not a casual claim. It is a hook, yes, but it is also a dark hypothesis based on the known realities of the Roman world. It suggests a specific, horrific personal act of cruelty. But to find the truth, we cannot simply look at the gladiator. We must look at the entire system that created him, the arena he fought in, and the society that cheered for his violence. The Rome we are discussing was not the Rome of marble philosophers and noble senators we often imagine. This was a civilization built on a foundation of absolute legalized brutality. Its economy was powered by mass enslavement, and its politics was stabilized by mass entertainment. The poet Juvenal famously called it panem et circenses, bread and circuses, but this phrase is deceptively simple. It implies a simple trade, free food and cheap entertainment in exchange for political obedience. The reality was a sophisticated form of mass psychological conditioning. The games were not just a distraction, they were a lesson. They taught the 80,000 people in the Colosseum the Roman virtues: courage in the face of death, mercilessness to the weak, and the absolute unshakable power of the state. The arena was where Rome's power was made visible. It was a theatre of cruelty designed to normalize the unthinkable, and at the center of this theatre was the gladiator. To understand what happens after the victory, we must first understand the victory itself. When the Emperor Trajan celebrated his conquest of Dacia, he held games that lasted 123 days. In those 4 months, 11,000 animals were slaughtered and 10,000 gladiators fought. This wasn't a rare event. It was the heartbeat of the empire. In this world, violence was currency, and status was everything. The Roman world was built on a simple, brutal binary: the dominus and the servus, the master and the slave, the one who commands and the one who must obey. There was no middle ground. A slave by law was not a person, they were res, a thing, an object. They were, in the chilling legal language of the time, instrumentum vocale, a tool with a voice. This is the single most important fact of our investigation. When we ask what a gladiator did to a female slave, we're asking what a thing did to another thing. And this is where the paradox begins. The gladiator himself was almost always a slave. He was a piece of property, bought and sold, trained at immense expense, and forced to kill for the profit of his master, the lanista, and the entertainment of the crowd. He was a condemned man, a prisoner of war, or an outcast who sold himself into bondage for a chance at fame. So how can one slave be given another slave as a prize? How can a man who is legally defined as human garbage, a status known as infamia, be granted the ultimate power over another human being? This is the central mystery. The title of our documentary implies a direct transaction. The gladiator wins, and a female slave is handed over, her fate sealed. But the reality of Roman power structures is far more complex and frankly far more terrifying. The Gladiator did not have the power. He was a puppet, albeit a very famous and expensive one. The power belonged to the editor, the sponsor of the games, the man in the box. He owned the arena, he owned the beasts, he owned the gladiators, and he owned the vast network of slaves required to make the spectacle happen. The female slaves in the arena complex were not just a potential reward. They were the logistical engine of the games. They were the Ancilla, the domestic servants who cleaned the barracks, mended the armour and served the fighters. They were the musicians, the actresses in the halftime shows, and most horrifyingly, they were sometimes the victims in the executions. So when we talk about a fate worse than death, what do we mean? For a Roman slave, death was a constant looming presence. It was often a release. Worse than death implies a state of being, a suffering that strips away not just life, but identity, agency, and hope, while forcing the body to remain. Our investigation will argue that this horror was not a single, isolated event of a brutal gladiator claiming a prize. The truth is systemic. The weight worse than death was the entire system of sexual exploitation that was the legal right of any master over any slave. It was the psychological torture of living in a world where your body was not your own, where you could be fed to beasts for the crowd's amusement, or forced to participate in grotesque mythological reenactments that ended in your public execution. The gladiator wasn't the monster. The system was the monster, and he was just one of its many instruments. In this series, we will dismantle the myth. We will separate the Hollywood fantasy of the victorious warrior from the bleak reality of the ludus, the gladiator school. We will examine the legal and social status of the Ancilla, the slave girl, and contrast it with the superstar slave, the gladiator. We will uncover the true nature of the gladiator's reward and confront the most terrifying spectacle of all, the damnatio ad bestias, the execution by wild animals, which was a fate reserved almost exclusively for the lowest classes and for slaves. The question is not simply, what did the gladiator do? The real question is, what did Rome allow to be done? And the answer to that will take us far deeper into the darkness than any single act of violence ever could. In the last section, we left two figures on the bloody sand, the victorious warrior and the terrified woman he dragged away. To understand that one brutal moment of transaction, we must first understand the two separate, parallel hells they inhabited before they ever met. Let's begin with the man, the victor. Let's call him Marcus. His day begins not with a sunrise, but with the sound of a heavy wooden bolt being drawn back. He's in the ludus, the gladiator school. He sleeps in a cellar, a small stone room barely larger than his body. It is a prison cell. He rises. His body is a map of scars, each one a memory of a mistake he survived. He is an investment. His lanista, the school owner, has spent a fortune on him. He receives specialised food, a high-carbohydrate diet of barley and beans, the gladiatorium saginam, designed to build a layer of fat over his muscles. This fat is not for comfort. It's a form of armour, meant to protect nerves and blood vessels from superficial cuts, to make the fight last longer, to make the spectacle bloodier but less immediately fatal. He is, by every definition, a slave, but he is also a rock star. This is the central paradox of his social status, known in law as infamia. On the streets of Rome, his image is everywhere. Graffiti on tavern walls praises his victories. Children play with small clay figurines of him. Wealthy Roman matrons, bored with their political husbands, fantasize about him. The poet Juvenal wrote scathingly of a senator's wife, Epia, who ran off to Egypt with her gladiator lover, ignoring her family and her country for a man who was, in her own words, disfigured. He has fame, he has notoriety, but in the eyes of Roman law he is less than human. He is infamous, infamous, or shamed. This is a specific legal brand. It means he cannot vote, he cannot make a will, he cannot appear as a witness in court. He is a social outcast grouped with actors, prostitutes and pimps. He is a man who is legally dead, even as the crowd screams his name. His body is not his own. It belongs to his lanista. If he wins, his master profits. If he dies, his master files an insurance claim with the editor who rented him for the games. He is a prized bull, a fighting cock, an expensive, replaceable thing trained to perform the act of death. His entire existence is focused on a single point, the arena. His fear is singular, a clean, quick death, or worse, a disabling wound that would make him useless, discarded. He's a slave to violence. Now let's look at the woman, the one dragged from the gate. Let's call her Lyra. We cannot know her real name. History doesn't record the names of women like her. She's an Ancilla, a household slave girl. Her day begins hours before the gladiators in the absolute dark. She sleeps not in a private cell, but on a straw mat in a corridor, or crammed into a tiny windowless room with 10 other women. Her world is the ludus, but she never holds a sword. Her world is the kitchen, the laundry, the infirmary, the latrines. She is the one who washes the blood from the gladiators' training tunics. She is the one who serves them their barley gruel. She's the one who empties their chamber pots. The gladiator is instrumentum vocale, a tool with a voice. But he is a specialized, expensive tool. Lyra's just a tool. She's a hammer, a broom, a cup. Her life as a Roman slave girl, an Ancilla, is defined by total, absolute and anonymous utility. Like the gladiator, her body is not her own. But the terms of her bondage are different and infinitely more terrifying. The gladiator's body is forfeit to the sand, to the arena. The Ancilla's body is forfeit to the master, at any time, for any reason. Roman law gave a master, the lanista or the editor, or any guest he wished to honour, the absolute right to use a slave's body for sexual purposes. This was not considered rape. Rape in the Roman law was a property crime, something one male citizen could commit against another male citizen's property, his wife, his daughter, or his slave. A master using his own slave was simply an exercising of property rights, like taking an apple from his own tree. While the gladiator trains, his body conditioned for a single violent purpose, the Ancilla moves through her day in a state of constant low-level terror. Her master is not just the lanista, it is the procurator of the school. It is the guards. It is the doctores who train the fighters. It is, potentially, the very gladiators she serves. This is the hierarchy of the damned. The gladiator, Marcus, is at the bottom of the social ladder. He is infamies. But Lyra, the Ancilla, exists on a rung beneath him. He is a slave of the state, a performer for the public. She is a slave of the household, a victim in private. His fear is the public death. Her fear is the private, daily, living death of dehumanization. His name, if he's good, will be remembered. Her name will be forgotten before she's even dead. So when we return to that moment on the sand, the victor, fresh from a kill, grabbing the woman from the gate, we are not watching an interaction between a man and a woman. We are watching a brutal demonstration of the pecking order within the slave system. The gladiator, in that moment of victory, is elevated. He is for a brief, shining second, a hero. He is full of adrenaline, power, and the affirmation of 80,000 screaming voices. He has just proven his value. The woman he grabs is, by definition, valueless. She's a perk, a bonus, a cup of wine handed to a thirsty worker. She is not his reward in the sense that he owns her. He cannot. A thing cannot own another thing. He doesn't have the legal capacity to be her master, but he can be her user. The editor, the true power in the arena, has simply extended his own property rights to his star performer. He's loaning his Ancilla to his gladiator, the same way a modern corporation might give its top salesman access to a company car for the night. This is the horrifying truth that underpins the myth. The gladiator is not the monster. He is just the first link in a chain of abuse, exercising the only form of power the system will ever grant him, the power to dehumanize someone even more powerless than himself. To truly understand the dynamic between Marcus the victor and Lyra the victim, we must now walk through the gates of their shared prison. This is the ludus, the gladiator school, and it is the crucible where the hierarchy of the damned is forged. Forget any notion of a simple training camp. The ludus was a fortress, a maximum security prison, and a multi-million-dollar business venture all rolled into one. The largest in Rome, the Ludus Magnus, was connected directly to the Colosseum by a massive underground tunnel. This was not a design of convenience, it was a design of control. It ensured that the livestock could be moved from their cages to the slaughterhouse without ever giving them a single glimpse of the city, not a single chance to run. At the absolute top of this self-contained universe sits one man, the lanista, the owner. He is a man who deals in human flesh. In Roman society, the lanista was viewed with almost as much contempt as the gladiators he owned. He was a pimp for death, a merchant of the damned. But within the stone walls of his ludus, his power was absolute. He was a king. The lanista owned the buildings, he owned the weapons, he owned the doctories who trained the men, he owned the bodies of his gladiators, and he owned the bodies of every Ancilla, every kitchen slave, every stable hand who worked there. His word was law, his whim was fate. Beneath the lanista were his enforcers, the doctores. These were the trainers, often former gladiators themselves, men who had survived the arena, won their freedom, and then chose to return to the only world they knew. They were the drill sergeants of this hell. Each doctor specialized in a specific fighting style, one for the retiarius, one for the secutor. They were brutal, exacting, and possessed the power to administer discipline. This meant the whip, the brand, or confinement in chains. This was the gladiator school's hierarchy. It was not a flat structure, it was a pyramid of pain. At the very bottom of the fighter pyramid was the tiro, the recruit. This is the man freshly captured in a war in Gaul or Germania, or a condemned criminal whose death sentence was commuted to service in the arena. He speaks no Latin. He understands nothing of his fate. He is terrified. The tiro is social non-existence. He is hazed, beaten by the doctorers and given the worst scraps of food. His life expectancy is measured in months, maybe weeks. He's the raw material, the uncarved stone. If a tiro survives his first few months of brutal training, he graduates. He becomes a gladiator. He is now part of the familia gladiatoria. But family is a grotesque misuse of the word. This was not a brotherhood. It was a carefully managed stable of competitors. The men were segregated by their fighting style, housed in different barracks. They were rivals. The man sleeping in the cellar next to you was not your brother in arms, he was your potential opponent. The lanista actively discouraged deep bonds, fostering a spirit of lethal competition. This was essential for the business. You don't want your prized assets refusing to kill each other in the arena because they became friends. As a gladiator wins, his status grows. He becomes a veteranus. He gets slightly better food. He might be allowed to keep a small portion of any prize money. But the true pinnacle is the primus palus, the first sword. This is Marcus, our victor from Section 1. The primus palus is the school's superstar. He is the face of the ludus. His name is the one graffiti scrawled on the walls. He is the lanista's single greatest asset. He receives the best medical care. Ancient surgeons were remarkably skilled at treating gladiator wounds, as it was excellent practice. He gets the best food, the best equipment. He may even be granted a private cellar, a small luxury in a world of none. He is, in effect, the king's slave. He has status, he has privilege, he has the adoration of the crowd, and this brings us back to Lyra, the Ancilla. Where does she fit in this brutal pyramid? She's not on it. She's underneath it. The tiro, the lowest, most pathetic gladiator recruit, still has a higher status than her. He has a monetary value as a fighter. He is an investment. Lyra is an expense. She is part of the overhead. She is a domestic slave, and in the ludus this meant she served everyone. She served the lanista as his absolute property. She served the doctores, who used their delegated authority as they saw fit, and here is the crucial link, she served the primus palus. When the lanista wanted to reward his primus palus for a great victory, what could he give him? He couldn't give him freedom, he couldn't give him legal rights. He couldn't give him actual money, which would be meaningless in a prison. He gave him perks, a better cut of meat, a flask of better wine, and as we saw on the arena sand, access to a woman. The transaction we witnessed in The Hook, Marcus dragging Lyra away, was not an act of personal conquest. It was an act of corporate privilege. The lanista, or the editor who was renting him, was simply gifting the use of one piece of his property to another. This is the true systemic horror. Lyra was not just a slave to one master, she was a slave to the entire hierarchy. Her body was a commodity, a bonus, a fringe benefit passed down the chain of command. The Gladiator's reward was the Lanista's way of reinforcing the Gladiator's status as primus palus. It was a psychological tool. It told Marcus, "You're not like the Tiro. You're not a common slave, you're almost a man. Look, you can even act like a master, at least for tonight." This hierarchy was the engine of the ludus. It gave the men something to fight for other than their survival, status. It created a world where a man who was legally defined as a thing would fight to the death just to be a better thing than the man next to him. And the ultimate reward for being the best thing was the right to treat another human being, the Ancilla, as no thing at all. The system didn't just create violence, it weaponized status, and it made sexual exploitation a tool of management. We have established the brutal hierarchy of the ludus, the prison school run by the Lanista. But on the day of the games, the Lanista is not the one in charge. He is merely a contractor, a man who has leased his expensive human livestock to a much more powerful figure. This figure is the editor, the sponsor of the games. This is the power of the editor. This man is not a social outcast. He is not a despised merchant of death. The editor is a senator, a magistrate, a wealthy patrician climbing the political ladder, or, quite often, the emperor himself. He is the man we saw in Section 1, sitting in the imperial box giving the bored nod. While the Lanista runs a business based on violence, the editor uses violence as a political tool. The games are his monstrously expensive gift to the people of Rome. He pays for the arenas, imports the exotic beasts from Africa and Asia, hires the musicians, and most importantly, he rents the gladiators from various ludi. He is not just a sponsor, he is the producer and director of the entire spectacle. And for the duration of the games, his power is absolute. It is a power so total, it is quasi-divine. We see this power demonstrated in a single iconic and often misunderstood gesture. The fight ends, a gladiator is wounded and disarmed. He falls to the sand and raises one finger, the adigitum, a plea for mercy. The crowd roars, they wave their handkerchiefs, they scream, "Mitte! Let him go!" or "Jugula! Kill him!" They're a single 80,000-throated monster demanding a verdict, but they are only the jury. The editor is the judge. He alone will read the crowd, gauge their mood, consider the cost of the gladiator, and then he gives the sign, the famous pollis verso, the turned thumb. We often imagine this as a simple thumbs up for life, thumbs down for death. The historical reality is murkier. It may have been a thumb pressed to the fist for mercy, or a thumb jabbed toward the throat for death. But the specific gesture doesn't matter. What matters is the absolute, unquestioned authority behind it. With a subtle movement of his hand, the editor can erase a man's life or grant him an improbable sunrise. This is the ultimate power, and he wields it publicly, casually, absorbing the cheers or jeers of the crowd as part of his political calculus. Now, this is the critical point. If a man has the casual, undisputed power to order the public execution of a highly trained, incredibly expensive superstar gladiator, what power do you think he holds over an anonymous, valueless Ancilla? The answer is total, unthinkable, unregistered. The gladiator's life has a price tag. The editor has to pay the Lanista a huge indemnity fee if a gladiator he rented is killed. But the life of a female slave like Lyra, she is a rounding error. She is a piece of inventory, no different from a wine amphora or a torch. This fundamentally reframes the reward we are investigating. The gladiator, Marcus, does not take Lyra as his prize. He cannot. He is a slave. He has no right to take anything. He is given Lyra, and the giver is the editor. The gladiator's reward after victory is not a transaction between the fighter and the woman. It is a transaction between two masters, the editor and the Lanista, executed upon two different grades of slave. Why would the editor do this? The motives are as cynical as the act itself. First, it is a display of magnificentia, magnificence or extravagant generosity. He's showing the crowd not only that he can provide death, but that he can also provide pleasure. He's the source of all things. He can give the crowd bread. He can give the victor his life. And he can give the victor a woman. It is all part of the same grand gesture of supreme control. Second, it's a business incentive. The editor wants the best show possible. He wants the gladiators to fight with a suicidal ferocity. By offering such visceral, immediate rewards, in addition to money, which would go to the Lanista anyway, he's manipulating the gladiators' base instincts. He's telling every tyro in the barracks, this is what awaits you. Survive, win, and you will be allowed for a moment to feel like a Roman. You will be allowed to act the master. And third, and perhaps most terrifying, sheer caprice, because he can. In the hyper-violent, status-obsessed world of the arena, the editor's power is so vast that the whim of his boredom can become a death sentence or a reward. He might see a slave girl serving wine near his box point and have her sent to the victor simply because the thought amused him. This is the true engine of the horror. The act we saw in The Hook, Marcus dragging Lyra away, is just the end of a chain of command. The true horror originates in the Imperial box, with a man who will never get his hands dirty, a man who sees both the killer and the victim as nothing more than puppets. The gladiator's victory gives him nothing but a few more minutes of life. The reward he receives is not his. It is a temporary loan, a perk of the office, and the Ancilla who is gifted to him is not even a person in the equation. She is the physical manifestation of the editor's power, a human token passed from one hand to another. So when we ask what the gladiator did to the female slave, we are asking the wrong question. The real question is, what did the editor empower, encourage and allow the gladiator to do? The gladiator may have been the weapon, but the editor was the hand that aimed it. We have now identified the true source of power, the editor. We have understood the brutal hierarchy of the ludus. And we have seen how the reward given to the gladiator was just a token, a perk, a temporary loan of one piece of property, Lyra, to another, Marcus. But to understand why this was a fate worse than death, we must now zoom out from the arena entirely. We must look past the blood and sand and examine the very bedrock of Roman society. Because the horror we are investigating was not an event, it was the atmosphere. It was the air that millions of people breathed every single day. This is the systemic horror of the sexual exploitation of slaves in Rome. On the surface, Roman civilization was obsessed with law, order and social decorum. They prided themselves on their mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. They wrote endlessly about honour, duty and, most importantly, pudicitia, modesty or sexual virtue. The first Emperor Augustus enacted a sweeping set of moral laws, the Leges Juliae, Julian laws. These laws were designed to restore the sanctity of marriage and family among the citizen class. They harshly penalised adultery. They championed fidelity. They dictated who could marry whose. These laws were Rome's public-facing brand. We are a moral, orderly, thorough and serious people. We are not barbarians. We have rules. But here is the profound, soul-crushing contradiction. This entire legal framework of morality and virtue applied only to citizens, and slaves were not citizens. They were not even legally people. We have mentioned the term res, a thing. We must now confront what this truly meant. Under Roman law, a slave had no personhood. They had no rights, no honour to defend, no virtue to protect. They could not be wronged in a legal sense, any more than a chair could be wronged if you sat on it. This legal vacuum created a system of absolute power. A master, the dominus, had the jus utendi et abutendi, the right to use and abuse his property. This right was total. For a female slave like Lyra, this meant her body was not her own. At any moment, for any reason, her master could demand sexual access. This was not considered rape. As we touched on before, the crime of raptus, rape, was a property crime. A man could be prosecuted for raping another man's slave, but the crime was against the owner, not the slave. The owner was compensated for the damage to his property. If a master used his own slave, it was not a crime at all. It was simply use. It was no different from him drinking his own wine or riding his own horse. This is the law versus reality we agreed to investigate. The law for citizens declared, you must protect your wife's honour. Adultery is a crime. The reality for slaves was, you may do whatever you wish to your Ancilla. Her honour does not exist. This systemic, legalized dehumanization is the worse than death that the title of our documentary refers to. It is not the singular, climactic act of violence from the Gladiator. It is the unending, low-frequency psychological torture of knowing you have no agency. It is the living death of being a tool with a voice. The Roman poet Martial, writing during the same era as the Colosseum's height, wrote poems that casually describe this reality. He jokes about masters, both male and female, using their slaves in every conceivable way. This wasn't seen as shocking, it was seen as normal, it was the mundane reality of the household. Now, let's place this reality back inside the ludus. The Gladiator school, as we established, was a hypermasculine, violent, and hierarchical prison. It was a pressure cooker of testosterone, fear, and desperation. The Lanista ruled it all. The female slaves, the Ancilli, who served in this environment were at the absolute bottom. They were surrounded by men trained to kill, managed by brutal doctors, and owned by a Lanista. The systemic sexual exploitation that was normal in a Roman household was amplified to an unbearable degree inside the ludus. The Ancilla was not just at risk of abuse. Abuse was a guaranteed structural part of her job description. So, when the editor gifts Lyra to Marcus the Gladiator, he's not creating a new horror. He's not introducing a new act of violence. He's simply transferring a right he already possessed. He's taking the systemic private abuse of the household and the ludus, and making it a public spectacle. The roar of the crowd as Marcus drags Lyra away is not just for his victory, it is for the public affirmation of the system. It is the crowd cheering for the ultimate expression of Roman power, the power of the dominus, represented by the editor, to do anything with his things. This is the true reward. The Gladiator isn't given a woman. He's given, for one night, the power of a master. He's allowed to participate in the very system that oppresses him. And for the woman, Lyra, this is the final horrifying humiliation. She's not just a victim of a private, hidden system of abuse. Her dehumanization has now become part of the panem circenses. She has become part of the circus. Her suffering has been made a public spectacle, a perk for a killer, and her fate is worse than death, because she is not even allowed the dignity of a private hell. She's been made a trophy. In the last section, we established the systemic, legalized sexual exploitation of slaves, a horror hidden behind the closed doors of the ludus and the private villas, a living death based on the Roman legal concept of res, the slave as a thing. But the arena was not a place for hidden things, it was a place for spectacle. It was where the private power of the dominus was made public, amplified 80,000-fold, and celebrated as entertainment. We now arrive at the heart of our investigation. We believe the terrifying phrase in our title, the fate worse than death, is not a reference to the private abuse by a gladiator. We believe it refers to a different, far more public, and infinitely more twisted spectacle. This was the Meridianum Spectaculum, the midday show. The gladiators were the main event, the primi. But what happened at lunchtime, when the wealthy patricians went for their midday meal and the arena was left to the common rabble? Executions. This was damnatio ad bestias, literally, condemnation to the beasts. This was a form of capital punishment reserved for the lowest of the low. Murderers, arsonists, deserters from the army, runaway slaves and Christians. A Roman citizen could not, under law, be sentenced to this. It was a fate designed specifically for non-persons. The standard procedure was simple and brutal. The condemned, often unarmed, were tied to stakes driven into the sand. Cages in the hypogeum, the vast dark network of tunnels beneath the arena, would open. Lions, bears, leopards, and wild boars, starved for days, would be lifted on elevators and released into the arena. The result was a foregone conclusion. It was mass butchery, set to the sounds of a hydraulic organ and the cheers of the crowd. This was horrific. It was a terrifying death. But it was not yet worse than death. It was just death, albeit a public and agonizing one. To find the true sickening horror, we must look at the editor's need for novitas, novelty. The Roman crowd, like any modern audience, got bored. They'd seen men torn apart by lions. They had seen 1,000 crucifixions. They demanded new, more creative, more artistic forms of cruelty. And so, the editor gave them the fatal charade. This was the ultimate expression of Roman power and depravity. They would take a condemned slave, usually a woman, and force her to reenact a violent myth. Her death would become a piece of theatre. Let's be explicit, because history demands it. The poet Martial, an eyewitness, describes these shows with a chilling, casual air. Consider the Greek myth of Pasiphae, the queen of Crete who, according to legend, lusted after a magnificent white bull. To consummate her desire, the inventor Daedalus built her a hollow wooden cow which she hid inside. The Romans, under the direction of an editor, decided to bring this myth to life. They would take a condemned female slave, our Lyra. They would build a prop, a hollow cow. They would force her inside it. And then, on the arena sand in front of thousands of spectators, they would release a bull, or perhaps a donkey, that had been trained or goaded into mating with the contraption. The woman inside, Lyra, would be publicly, ritualistically raped by an animal as entertainment. The trauma, the internal injuries would almost certainly kill her. And the crowd would applaud, not just for the death, but for the historical accuracy. This is not conjecture. This is what they did. Consider the myth of Dirce. In the legend, she was punished for her cruelty by being tied to the horns of a wild bull, which dragged and gored her to death. The Romans would reenact this. A terrified woman, stripped naked to play the part, would be physically tied to a living, enraged bull and released onto the sand to be torn to pieces, all as art, or they would stage the death of Hercules. They would build a real funeral pyre, place a condemned man or woman dressed as Hercules' wife Creusa upon it and set it on fire. The victim would be burned alive, their screams muffled by the crowd's applause for the special effect. This is the true fate worse than death. It is the fusion of every horror we have discussed into one unbearable public event. It is the sexual exploitation of slaves made public. It is the power of the editor taken to its most godlike sadistic extreme. It is the absolute negation of the Ancilla's humanity. Death by lion is simple death, but to be forced into a wooden cow and raped by a beast, that is a psychological destruction before the physical one. It is the ultimate act of dehumanization. The editor is not just killing a thing, res. He is forcing the thing to participate in a story, to become a prop in her own violation and execution. Her identity is erased, replaced by a character from myth. Her final moments of terror are not her own. They're a performance. Her suffering is not a tragedy, it is entertainment. So, when we look back at our title, what Roman gladiators did to female slaves after victory was worse than death, we can now see the awful truth. The title is a bait and switch that history itself has performed. The common man may have imagined the gladiator's private, brutal reward. But the real documented horror, the one that scholars like Martial and Suetonius recorded, was this. The editor's public, scripted, mythological execution of a female slave. The gladiator's act was one of dominance. The editor's act was one of erasure. That is the difference. And that is the true unspoken meaning of worse than death. In the last section, we uncovered the theatre of sadism, the damnatio ad bestias and the fatal charades. We argued that this was the true, documented fate worse than death. So, we must now return to our starting point. We must confront the very title of this documentary. What about the gladiator, Marcus? What about the female slave, Lyra, being dragged from the arena? Was that scene we painted in our hook a lie? No, but it is a profound misunderstanding. The myth that a gladiator personally received a female slave as a prize for his victory is a potent, enduring one. It's a myth that has been supercharged by Hollywood and popular fiction because it's simple, visceral, and personal. It creates a simple villain and a simple victim. The truth, as we've discovered, is systemic, complex, and far more horrifying because it lacks that simple villain. Let's reconcile the myth with the reality. We propose that the enduring legend, the one that whispers of what Roman gladiators did to female slaves, is not a single factual event. Instead, it is a confused, dark amalgamation of three separate and very real truths about Roman society. First, the truth of the gladiator as a sex symbol. This is perhaps the most shocking paradox of his existence. As we've established, he was infamous, the lowest rung of society, legally human garbage. And yet, he was the object of intense, often hysterical, female desire, particularly from the very top of that society. Roman moralists like Juvenal and Tacitus wrote with disgust about patrician women, senators' wives, who would disguise themselves, sneak into the ludus at night and pay exorbitant sums to the lanista for a chance to spend a night with their favourite fighter. Graffiti from Pompeii bears this out. One famous scrawl reads, "Celadus, the Thracian, makes all the girls sigh." The gladiator was the bad boy of the ancient world. He was pure forbidden animal magnetism. He was a thing, yes, but he was a thing that represented the ultimate masculine taboo, a man who lived with death every day. So, the idea of the gladiator and sex was already powerfully linked in the Roman imagination. Second, the truth we explored earlier, the gladiator's supposed reward after victory. This was the editor's perk. As we argued, it is highly unlikely this happened on the arena sand itself. It was too messy, too public, and frankly, bad for business. The real transaction was almost certainly the one we described, the editor or lanista gifting his primus palus, his star fighter, a temporary loan of an Ancilla back in the ludus. This was a private managerial tool, a bonus to ensure loyalty and incentivize performance. It was a cold, calculated business transaction. This was the reality of the prize. It was real, it was exploitative, but it was private. And third, the truth we just witnessed in Section 6, the public spectacle of Damnatio ad Bestias and the fatal charades. This was the true fate worse than death. This was the documented, public, mythological torture and execution of female slaves and criminals. It was a spectacle of ultimate dehumanization, combining sexual humiliation with public execution. Now, let's put these truths together. The public knew gladiators were sex symbols. They knew gladiators received rewards for victory, and they witnessed female slaves being horrifically tortured to death in the arena in fatal charades. It is not difficult to see how, over centuries, these three distinct realities blurred. The human mind seeks simple stories. It is easier to imagine a simple narrative. The gladiator wins his victory, and his reward is to publicly torture the female slave. The myth takes the systemic, impersonal horror of the editor's fatal charade and transfers the blame to a single, brutal figure, the gladiator. This is where our final piece of the law versus reality puzzle fits. The myth must be false because of the gladiator's legal status. A slave, infames and legally a thing, could never be given legal ownership, dominium, over another thing. It's a legal impossibility. He could not own her any more than a shovel could own a bucket. He could only use her, and that use was only possible because it was delegated to him by the true master, the editor, as a temporary perk. The gladiator had no agency in this. He was a tool, the Ancilla was a tool, and the editor was the hand that banged them together. So, when we re-examine the myth, we are debunking a simplified fantasy to reveal a systemic truth. The horror isn't what the gladiator did. The horror is that the gladiator, the Ancilla, the lions, the arena, and the myth itself were all just pieces in a vast, sophisticated machine of state-sponsored terror, designed by the elite editor to control and condition the masses. The myth provides a simple monster. The reality reveals that the entire system was the monster. The gladiator wasn't the man who inflicted the fate worse than death. He was just another soul, one rung above the absolute bottom, trapped in the same machine, desperate to survive. The real horror, the fatal charade, was happening in plain sight, and it was far too terrible, too systemic for our collective memory to process. So we created a simpler, smaller story to take its place. We've spent our time in the dark underbelly of the Roman system, uncovering a reality of systemic abuse and spectacular sadistic execution. We have defined the lives of Marcus, the gladiator, and Lyra, the Ancilla, by the rules that bound them. Now we must confront the exception, the anomaly, the figure that seems to break every rule we have just established. The female gladiators, the Gladiatrix. The evidence is sparse, but it is undeniable. It exists etched in stone and ridiculed in poetry. The most famous artifact is a marble relief from Halicarnassus, dating to the 1st or 2nd century AD. It shows two women, heavily armed in the manner of male gladiators. They are not wearing helmets, perhaps to show their faces, to make their gender clear. Their names are carved above them, Amazon and Ancilla, mythological stage names. Emperors like Nero and Domitian were known to stage games featuring gladiatrices, so they were real. They fought and presumably they bled and died, just like the men. This fact presents a profound challenge to our entire narrative. If the Roman world was built on the total subjugation of the female body, as seen with Lyra, if female virtue, pudicitia, was paramount, at least on paper, how could a gladiatrix possibly exist? How could a woman be allowed to pick up a sword, a symbol of masculine virtues, virtue, manliness, and perform the ultimate act of public violent transgression? The answer lies in our central theme, the absolute power of the editor and the Roman thirst for novitas, novelty. The gladiatrix was not a symbol of female empowerment. She was not a proto-feminist icon breaking chains. She was, in the cold, calculating eyes of the editor who staged the fight, the ultimate freak show. Let's analyse the social reaction to them. The same poets and historians who described the damnatio ad bestias, the execution of female slaves, with casual boredom, wrote about the gladiatrix with a unique blend of fascination and absolute disgust. Juvenal, the master satirist, wrote a scathing passage about these women. He described them as bold as any man, grunting as they trained, their legs wrapped in heavy armour. He mocks a noblewoman named Mevia who hunted boars in the arena, spear in hand, breasts exposed. His tone is not admiration, it is contempt. Why? Because the gladiatrix was not just a killer, she was a social abomination. She was willfully transgressing the most sacred boundary in the Roman mind, the boundary of gender. A good Roman woman was defined by three things: silence, modesty, and domesticity. The gladiatrix was loud, exposed, and public. She was, in every sense, the anti-Roman woman, and that was precisely the point. The editor didn't stage these fights to prove women were equal to men. He staged them to shock the audience by showing them the world turned upside down. It was the same impulse that led them to stage fights between dwarves, or between a gladiator and an elephant. It was a spectacle of the bizarre. The crowd's reaction was therefore complex. They were titillated, certainly. It was a taboo made real. But they were also repulsed. They were watching a violation of the natural order. This was the ultimate novelty act. This explains her place in our narrative. The gladiatrix does not contradict the fate of Lyra, the Ancilla. Instead, she reinforces the system's cruelty. Look at it this way. Lyra the Ancilla was a victim of the norm. Her exploitation was the mundane, everyday, legalized reality of her status as a thing. The victim of the fatal charade was a victim of punishment. She was a condemned criminal, and her public torture was a lesson in state power. The gladiatrix, however, was a victim of spectacle. She was allowed to break the rules, not for her own freedom, but for the crowd's amusement. She was a curiosity, an exotic animal, permitted to act the role of a man before likely being killed. Her freedom to fight was her illusion. It was a leash held by the editor that was just long enough for her to perform her bizarre, transgressive dance before being pulled back. In fact, her existence may have made the lives of ordinary women worse. By presenting this grotesque masculine woman in the arena, the editor was implicitly reinforcing what a proper woman should be. The gladiatrix became the exception that proved the rule. She was the monster, the other, which made the silent, subjugated Ancilla seem normal and correct. She was not a challenge to the system. She was the system's most cynical joke. She was given a sword, but she was never given power. She was given a stage, but she was never given a voice. She was, just like Lyra, and just like Marcus, another thing owned by the editor, packaged for public consumption in the most shocking way he could imagine. The gladiatrix, then, is the final proof of the arena's logic. It could consume anything. It could take a man's honour, infamia. It could take a woman's body, the Ancilla. It could take a woman's death and turn it into art, the damnatio. And in its final, most cynical act, it could take the very idea of female transgression, pudicitia, package it, put a helmet on it, and sell it as a midday entertainment. We have navigated the arena, the ludus, and the twisted legal framework of Rome. We have seen the systemic abuse of the Ancilla and the spectacular cruelty of the fatal charade. We have even explored the anomaly of the Gladiatrix. We have focused almost entirely on the process of death, both social and physical. But what about the ones who didn't die? What about the survivors? This is the final haunting question of our investigation. What does life look like for a person who has endured a fate worse than death? Let's first consider the gladiator Marcus. Against all odds, he survives. He wins fight after fight. He becomes a legend, the Primus Palus. And one day, after years of killing, the editor grants him the Rudius. This is the wooden sword, the symbol of his freedom. The crowd roars. He is no longer a gladiator. He is a libertus, a freedman. He walks out of the ludus for the first time as a free man. What does he find? He finds a world that will never let him forget what he was. His freedom is a legal contract, but it is not a social pardon. He is still infamies. The brand of infamy he carried as a gladiator does not wash off with his freedom. Respectable citizens shun him. He cannot hold political office. He cannot join the legions. He is barred from polite society. The very fame that kept him alive in the arena now makes him a pariah outside of it. He is a walking scandal, a man whose hands are permanently stained with the unclean blood of the arena. But the social stigma is perhaps the least of his burdens. The real prison is the one he carries inside his head. We must be clear. The gladiator was a victim of profound, repeated, and state-sponsored trauma. He did not just witness death. He was forced to inflict it over and over as a condition of his own survival. This is a psychological burden that modern science is only beginning to understand in the context of soldiers. The Romans had no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. What does this free man do? How does he sleep? Does he see the faces of the men he killed? Does he wake up screaming, reaching for a sword that is no longer there? Many, perhaps most, freed gladiators never truly left. They stayed at the ludus, becoming the doctorers and lanistae of the next generation. They returned to the only world that made sense, the only place where their scars were understood, perpetuating the very system that had destroyed them. This is the legacy of his survival. He escapes physical death in the arena, only to be trapped in a permanent psychological death outside of it. He is a ghost, haunting at a world that created him and then despised him for existing. His freedom is just a larger, more confusing cellar. Now consider the Ancilla, Lyra. Her path to freedom is even more precarious. A master might free his slave in his will, or she might, through decades of meticulous saving, if she was allowed to keep tips or peculium, buy her own freedom. She becomes a liberta, a freedwoman. She steps out of the ludus, free from the daily systemic sexual exploitation, free from the terror of the editor's whims. But what does she find? She finds a world that views her as used goods. Her entire identity is defined by her past as a thing. If she tries to marry, her status as a liberta taints her and her children. Like the gladiator, she is socially ostracized. But her trauma is different. His was the trauma of inflicting violence. Hers was the trauma of absorbing it. His trauma was public, celebrated, and recorded on graffiti. Her trauma was private, silent, and systematically ignored. It was the trauma of having no voice, no agency, no. It was the trauma of being an instrumentum vocale, a tool with a voice that no one was legally required to listen to. How does she reintegrate into a society whose fundamental legal and social structure enabled her abuse? How does she walk past a temple dedicated to pudicitia, modesty, when she was legally denied the right to her own? This is the true insidious nature of the fate worse than death. The worst part isn't the act itself, it is the survival, the act of violence, the moment of rape, the terror of the fatal charade. These are finite, they happen in a moment. But the trauma of being dehumanized, the knowledge that you were once considered a thing, that is infinite. It is a poison that outlives the poisoner. The gladiator and the Ancilla are two sides of the same broken coin. They are the living dead. They are the survivors who carry the arena inside them forever. When we ask what happens after the sand, the answer is bleak. Nothing. The sand never truly washes off. The editor in his box, the spectators in their seats, they could watch the fatal charade, watch the death of Dirce, and then go home to their villas for dinner. They could consume the horror and then discard it. But Marcus and Lyra, the free survivors, did not have that luxury. They were forced to live inside the horror for the rest of their lives. They were the human cost, the living wreckage of panem et circenses. Their freedom was simply the right to carry their own trauma, unassisted, through a world that refused to acknowledge it. And that is the final, and perhaps most profound, definition of a fate worse than death. We have come to the end of our investigation. We began this journey with a dark, sensational question, a hook promising a story about what Roman gladiators did to female slaves. We started with a myth of a simple, personal act of brutality, a monster, Marcus, and a victim, Lyra. What we found was not a myth, but a bait and switch perpetrated by history itself. The simple personal horror was a mask, a story created to hide a truth that was infinitely larger and more terrifying. We found a system, a sophisticated legal and economic machine designed to do one thing: turn human beings into things. We found the quiet, systemic horror of the ludus and the Roman household, where the sexual exploitation of slaves was not a crime, but a perk of ownership. This was the living death of the Ancilla. Then, we found the loud, spectacular horror of the arena, the damnatio ad bestias. We discovered the fatal charades, the mythological reenactments where female slaves were publicly tortured and killed, not just as punishment but as art. We learned that the Gladiator, our supposed villain, was just another pawn. He was a piece of infamia, a slave superstar, a tool used by the true power, the editor. It was the editor, the politician, the sponsor, who sat in his box and directed the entire spectacle of dehumanization, from the Gladiators' fight to the Ancilla's execution. The Colosseum is a ruin now, the ludus is dust, the Roman Empire is a collection of maps and artifacts. It is tempting then to look back at these horrors, at the casual cruelty of the editor, at the nightmare of the fatal charade, and to comfort ourselves. We tell ourselves, that was then, we're civilized now, we are better. Are we? This is the final and most important question. The stone walls of the arena may have fallen, but the arena's shadow is long. The idea of the arena, the psychology that made it possible, is not dead. It has merely evolved. The Romans called it panem et circenses, bread and circuses, a simple formula to keep the masses fed, entertained, and most importantly distracted. They used the spectacle of violence to condition the population, to teach them the state's power, and to normalize the dehumanization of the other. The slave, the criminal, the barbarian. We no longer have gladiators, but we have multi-billion-dollar entertainment industries built around simulated and sometimes very real violence. We watch from the safety of our seats as men in modern arenas inflict spectacular damage on one another, all for our entertainment. We consume it, we cheer for it, and we call it sport. We no longer have the damnatio ad bestias, but we have the 24-hour news cycle. We have social media, we have the internet. When a tragedy strikes, when a war begins, when a life is publicly destroyed, what do? We watch, we share, we comment, we consume the raw footage of human suffering from the safe distance of our screens, just as the Roman citizen, perfumed with saffron, watched the Meridianum Spectaculum from his seat. The technology has changed, but has the impulse. We no longer brand our outcasts with the legal term infamia, but we have a celebrity culture that mirrors it perfectly. We elevate people to godlike status, actors, musicians, influencers, and then, the moment they make a mistake, we, the digital crowd, scream "Ugula, kill them!" We participate in cancel culture, the modern, bloodless execution, where a person's social life and career are torn apart for our amusement and our moral satisfaction. We build them up as icons, only to feel a perverse thrill when we tear them down as things. And finally, the Ancilla, the tool with a voice, the thing whose body was a commodity. Does she not still exist? In a world of online pornography, human trafficking, and the casual digital objectification of women, have we truly escaped the Roman legal definition of res? The editor may be gone, but the market for dehumanization is stronger than ever. This is the true shadow of the arena. The danger was never the sword or the lion. The true danger, the true poison, was the spectacle. It was the act of watching. It was the process of turning a person with a name, a family, a soul into a prop, an object, piece of entertainment. The moment we watch another human's pain, humiliation, or death as content, we are in principle no different from the Roman screaming for the Retirius to finish the kill. We have entered the arena. We have become the editor. The question then is not what the Romans did. The question is what we are doing. The question is how we, in our modern technological Colosseum, choose to consume the suffering of others. The Gladiatrix was a freak show for violating gender norms. The Ancilla was a reward for a killer. The condemned woman in the fatal charade was art. It is our job as conscious human beings to see the systems at play. It is our job to see the editor behind the show. It is our job to refuse to be entertained by dehumanization. Because the moment we mistake a person for a prop, the arena's shadow has fallen over us. And the games have begun again. Thank you for joining this investigation. If this story made you think, please join the discussion in the comments. How do you see the arena's shadow in our world today? It's a conversation worth having. And if you believe these hidden histories need to be told, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the truths we were never meant to find. We'll see you in the next one.